Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Most, if not all of us, have bucket lists, places we want to visit, but don't always get the opportunity. This is Kurt Repanshek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. One of the destinations on my bucket list has been Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve and the Noatak River that runs through it. A week or two floating down the river sounds pretty ideal to me. While it's debatable whether I'll cross that off my bucket list, that remains to be seen, but today's guest has floated the river more than once and backpacked pretty much all over Gates of the Arctic. And Jon Waterman returned from those trips with incredible stories of places he saw, the people he met, and the wildlife that came in range of his eyes. But over the course of several decades, Jon also has witnessed the impact of climate change to the region, and it hasn't been good. It's the main thread of a story he lays out in his latest book, Into the Thaw. We'll be back in a minute with Jon.
Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference too at friendsofacadia.org.
Hi, Jon. Welcome to The Traveler.
Pleasure to be here with you.
It's great because, like I said in my introduction, Gates of the Arctic is on my bucket list, and if I can't get there, I'll live vicariously through your words and our conversation today. But before we get into your latest book, how did you find yourself in Alaska back in the 1980s?
Well, I first went to Alaska in 1976, and the hook was firmly set that year. And not only because I was interested in climbing the peaks, the huge remote glaciated peaks in Alaska and Canada, but I also fell in love with the wilderness and eventually had a job in the early 80s for several seasons as a Denali mountaineering ranger, which thoroughly indoctrinated me to Alaska.
That's quite a change of scenery from the Boston area where you grew up from.
Yeah, I fled the East Coast when I was pretty young for the open horizons of the West and particularly for the frontier of Alaska, and never looked back.
Yeah, my story is somewhat the same. I fled the East as well. I didn't get quite as far as Alaska, and it took a couple jumps before I got out to the Rocky Mountains, but it's definitely home, and I enjoyed it a lot more than back east, although my parents long wished that I would move back and be closer to them. But once you get a taste of the Rocky Mountains or the wilderness up in Alaska, it's hard to let go of that. Now, as you mentioned, you were a mountaineering guide in Denali. Was that just a seasonal job, or was that year-round?
Well, it was a 6 months a year job. I was a mountaineering ranger, but I had also worked as a guide, both before and after I was a mountaineering ranger. So I worked from March through almost all the way to October of every year. And then eventually quit the Park Service and really took up travel in the north, particularly the far north of the Arctic Circle.
Now, what were you, a paddler before you headed off from Denali?
Well, I'm a generalist. I was a very passionate climber and mountaineer, but as a mountaineering ranger and a guide, I learned to do a lot of other things too. I like going on long, immersive journeys. And of course, I learned how to paddle in the whitewater and calm water and ski and sail and run dog sleds. I like to do it all. And for me, the ultimate trip was trying to combine as many different modes of travel as I could.
Yeah, no, that sounds incredible.
Non-motorized travel, I might.
Non-motor, muscle powered.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was really taken by your kayak trips. I mean, I like to kayak, but I think the longest I've ever been out is 4 days, 5 days, and you're talking about hundreds of miles across open ocean, pretty much by yourself. The first trip must have been, I wouldn't say perilous, but a little nervous, perhaps.
Well, I'd learned on mountaineering expeditions that you really get to the next stage when you're out for more than a week and you begin to become used to the cold and sort of enamored of all the chores that are involved in travel and in camp life. Moreover, you became really sharp. Your intuition sharpens up when you're out for a long time. So I became a connoisseur of long journeys. And the best way to take a long journey, I mean, it's one thing to go on a mountaineering trip with a pack on your back, but it's a lot easier to do it with a sea kayak because you can put, if you're really crafty, you can put a couple months of food in a sea kayak first, and you don't have to carry it on your back.
Right. Right.
In
That's the big
addition to
plus.
paddling, you can sail a sea kayak. So I really fell in love with the art of long sea kayak journeys.
Now, one of the things you encounter with that, and you mentioned that in your book, is a loneliness when you're out there by yourself for such a long time over such open conditions. And then once you get over that loneliness, when you re-encounter human beings, you have to change gears again, right?
Yeah, yeah. It was a goal of mine to actually just see how I would change and how I would respond to the wilderness alone. And I don't mean for a couple of days. I was alone for as long as 25 days continuously on my various trips across the top of the continent. And it was kind of a final exam for all the expeditioneering that I'd done to be able to be entirely self-sufficient. And there's a real sense of pride and joy in that, and being completely self-sufficient, determining your own schedule, figuring out how to be safe, and occasionally cutting it close, but not taking too many risks. And that's what I set out to do was to be alone for long periods of times. And of course, I learned that I'm not a misanthrope. So although it was difficult to answer your question, when I came back into villages, when I did my Arctic crossing, it was a wonderful re-entry, if you will, because the people in the north, the Inuit people, are conversational minimalists. So it was always a very pleasant re-entry. They didn't ask me a lot of questions. There was a lot of time just hanging out and smiling and sharing food.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. Now, can you create a visual setting of the Noatak River for our listeners? I mean, as you point out in your book, it's the largest undisturbed river basin in the United States. And for many of us in the lower 48, that's kind of hard to visualize.
Well, yeah, collectively, it is hard to visualize. And every time I'd go back north, whether it was to the Noatak or other places, I'd have to reacquaint myself with a sense of scale, because in much of the Arctic, for instance, the headwaters of the Noatak, there are no trees, no buildings, no trails. So you don't have the normal visual cues. And it takes a while to get used to. Like being alone, it nearly takes, a good week of being out there to kind of feel comfortable in such vast surroundings. But the Noatak River, is one of the longest undeveloped and really wild places, really wild river sheds in North America. Collectively, there's 13 million acres of legislated wilderness contained in the two park units in Gates of the Arctic National Park and Noatak National Preserve. But that doesn't even take into account the fact that there's really no one living out there. There are some villages on either side of this vast wilderness, but mostly it's just a remote country that stretches for hundreds and hundreds of miles in either direction. So it's a place where you can really lose yourself and really come to a new contemplation of nature.
Now, you recount incidents with polar bears, though from a distance at least. Did you ever have any close encounters with wildlife that would be best encountered from a distance?
I had many close encounters with various wildlife, um, usually bears, because bears tend to put the fear in you. But I had some amazing wolf encounters. One time I was camped on the tip of Cape Bathurst in the Canadian Arctic, and I hadn't talked to anyone for more than a week, hadn't seen a plane or even another boat. And I was just over that pang of loneliness and accustomed to my surroundings, and a wolf saw me from a couple miles away. I happened to see the wolf, and it was through my binoculars. It was chasing a caribou and a calf. It gave up the chase, and it must have smelled me, and it came running all the way out to the end of Cape Bathurst to investigate me, and it ran right into my camp and ran a circle around me. And I wasn't the least bit afraid. I think that if I hadn't been alone for a week and vying for company, maybe I would have been a little bit frightened. But there was no menace to this wolf. It was just curious, as curious as I was, and it was an amazing encounter to have a wolf come from so far away and just kind of stop and then run a circle around you and then leave. It's just like it was saying hello. So I had many encounters like that. Typically, they'd happen when I was alone. Wildlife is a lot more liable to approach you when you're alone, and particularly when you're calm. But I had many bears chase me as well. The grizzly bears, I think, is a much more aggressive, omnivorous animal than the polar bear. And I had repeatedly had encounters with grizzly bears that always put the fear of God into me. But I was always prepared too. And you can out paddle a grizzly bear. I actually had grizzly bears jump in the water and try to catch me a couple of times. But you can't out paddle a polar bear.
Yeah, I was surprised to read that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, their paws, they've evolved over more than 250,000 years to become a marine mammal. And their paws are like flippers. And they will hold their head under the water, sometimes just stick their black nose above the water so you can't even see them. But they're really adept swimmers. They can swim for days on end. They're marine mammals, very different from the grizzly bears.
Yeah, yeah. Now I've heard that grizzlies can sprint up to 30 miles an hour. Any idea how fast a polar bear can swim?
I think I've seen that. I don't know how fast they can swim, faster than I can paddle. They can swim 3 or 4 miles an hour easily. And I've seen them run on land. They can run just like a grizzly on land. They're built to stalk other animals. The polar bear is mostly built to stalk seals in the sea.
Did you get a sense that the wildlife up there was a little different than the wildlife down in the States? You go to Yellowstone and you can see wolves and grizzlies, and usually they're heading in the other direction.
Well, a lot of my wildlife encounters were usually with wildlife that hadn't seen a lot of people. And Yellowstone's a good example because there are herd animals there too. But the caribou herds are enormous. We're talking about the herds that have reached as many as 500,000 animals. The Western Arctic herd used to be 500,000. Now they're down to 152,000. But you can be amidst, and I've repeatedly been amidst hundreds of animals at a time. Then you can, more commonly, you can go for days or weeks, scarcely seeing more than birds. So it's a vast place.
Now, of course, talking about the Arctic and your book, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the oil beneath it. I mean, the country has gone back and forth over whether to drill there, with the first Trump administration favoring drilling and the Biden administration, of course, putting the brakes on it. What are your thoughts? I mean, you were up there, you walked it, you paddled past it.
Well, of course, as a supporter of wilderness and keeping wild places wild, I think it's important that the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge be kept inviolate. In other words, there should not be drill pads and drilling there. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the principal reasons is that much of the North Slope of Alaska is already crisscrossed with oil development, not only on the land, but out at sea. There's drilling offshore. And if we can't have one inviolate place, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge on the very northeastern corner of Alaska, up against the border of Canada, if we can't have that one place, what good are we as a nation? Where is our sensibility in terms of preserving wild places? So I'm very concerned in the next 4 years what might happen to the Arctic Refuge under this new administration.
I wonder if the path hasn't already been set. We're going to get into that in a minute. This is Kurt Repanshek with the National Parks Traveler. Our guest today is the writer Jon Waterman, who his latest book has just come out. It's called Into the Thaw. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. You can show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
Hi, Kurt Repanshek, founder and editor-in-chief of the National Parks Traveler. I hope today's podcast about the challenges the National Park Service and the National Park System are facing is of interest to you in helping you appreciate what the Park Service and the national parks are up against. At The Traveler, our role is to bring these stories, along with stories of exploration, scientific discovery, and cultural history, to your attention. After all, these lands belong to you, the American taxpayers, and you should know how they're being cared for. If you appreciate this coverage and find it critical, I hope you'll support The Traveler with a donation. We're in the middle of the annual Newsmatch campaign to raise charitable dollars for nonprofit media organizations, and we really could use your support so we're able to continue producing these stories for your benefit. Please view the donate page on the Traveler website and contribute what you can to our nonprofit news organization. After all, it's essential coverage for essential places. Now, Jon, one factoid, I guess we'd call it, that you point out in your book is that at the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, they're talking about basically 1 year's supply of oil that will take 50 years to develop. Did I get that right?
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to crunch the numbers, but that's the general sense of how much oil might be there. That, at any rate, there might be a tremendous amount of oil, but there's a lot of oil in other places, and the cost of developing it it's not worth it. The sacrifice that would be made because the porcupine caribou herd depend upon calving there in that coastal plain, along with hundreds of thousands of birds and just the whole sanctity of wilderness. I think it's important to preserve this place.
And of course, another threat to the wilderness up there, to the wildlife up there, is the Ambler Road. There's a concern that might come back to life in the next 4 years.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. That is a road that would be built to a mine. It would actually near Ambler, Alaska, and that would cut off the Western Arctic caribou herds' migration route, as well as allowing access into that very southern corner of Gates of the Arctic National Park, and another piece of inviolate wilderness that's potentially ripe for those that want to exploit mineral riches.
Another number I seem to recall, not from your book, but from in our reporting on the Ambler Road and what it would do. I mean, they're talking about, I think, thousands of stream crossings to get that road in. I mean, that's also hard to get your head around.
Yeah, The bottom line is that in the north, as far down as the subarctic, the Earth is underlain by permafrost, and so it's not just the likely damages they would do to these amazing wetlands and the hundreds of streams the road would have to bridge, but the Earth is underlain with frozen soil and ice, collectively known as permafrost. And it's very difficult to build atop permafrost. You need, 4 or 5 feet of gravel to insulate the permafrost. So the amount of material they would have to bring in, not only to bridge all these streams and not block off the wetlands and the stream flows, but just to insulate the road from the permafrost underneath. And they've proven with other roads that already exist in that portion of Northwest Alaska, such as there's a road to Red Dog Mine on the coast of the Chukchi Sea, which the Park Service has done a study and found that it has really changed the caribou migration, because the caribou are reluctant to cross that road, and they'll spend days lingering on the north and south sides of the roads before they actually cross it, because of all the truck traffic and the obvious barrier presented by the road itself.
Now, of course, you talk about energy exploration and development. You talk about roads to build mines. I mean, they're all contributors to climate change. And in your book, you admit that back in the late 70s and the 80s, when you first got out to Alaska, that you hadn't thought that much about climate change or observed it on some of your earlier expeditions. But things have gotten so different on the Noatak that you decide to study what had happened there and elsewhere in the Arctic. In the book, you launched the final journey, as a chapter is called, down the river in 2022 to document the changes and understand their effects on the land and its people. And out of that journey and accounts of earlier expeditions, you created Into the Thaw. I mean, it must have been a really a paradigm change over the decades, what you've seen up there and what's going on today.
Yes, very much so. And if I may take the luxury to describe the inspiration for the book, it came about because of my familiarity with the Noatak River from the early 1980s. Sort of set a very vivid impression of that particular landscape and the river and the wildlife there. And then I explored other places throughout the Arctic and didn't go back to the Noatak River or gates of the Arctic National Park for about 36 years. And when I went back in 2021, I took my 15-year-old son, and I was so startled by the changes. For instance, we went swimming in the river the same time of year that I'd been on the Noatak River more than 30 years previously. It's something we never would have dreamed of doing. We had to set up the raft on its side just to get out of the sun. It was so hot. We were walking around in our shorts. I didn't have a pair of shorts, so I just was striding around in my underwear. It was so warm. And in 100 miles of river, we saw one caribou, my son and I. And in 1983, when I went for the first time, we saw thousands of caribou. And the brush was obviously overgrowing the banks. The river was flooded in a way that I'd never seen it flooded in the early 1980s. So that was the inspiration for the book. I returned the following year and took a dream trip, actually. I've always wanted to do the entire Noatak. So we found the very first waters of the Noatak and traveled, myself and photographer Chris Korbulek traveled the entire length of the river and then trekked up the coast, about 500 miles in total, in order to document more thoroughly these changes that I'd seen the previous year. And of course, this allowed me to re-examine my journals from past years where I had encountered climate change, but hadn't really investigated it very thoroughly.
That 21 trip with your son must have been incredible, both to introduce your son to that part of the world, while at the same time seeing what climate change was doing to the landscape. I mean, how did you explain that to your son? I mean, on one hand, if I was a 15-year-old and my dad said we're going to Alaska for a backcountry trip for a week or two, that'd be an incredible experience. And yet when you got there on the landscape, for you, it had changed. How do you explain that to your son?
Yeah, exactly. How do you explain it to your son? I went with the idea of sharing, the wilderness values that I'd spent a lifetime earning. And of course, I'd taken him on other trips in Colorado, but never to the Arctic. And instead, the trip turned into something else. It turned into, by the end of the trip, it was actually kind of a bit sad because we had to sort of talk about climate change and his impressions of it. And of course, my reaction to it is that we have to take action. We have to not only document it and report on it, but we have to figure out ways to reduce our own footprints.
What do the locals think?
Well, the Inuit and Inupiat people are the most resilient people on Earth, by my understanding. And, they've had to adapt over many centuries to times of food insecurity when the caribou populations didn't rebound. So now, however, they are faced with what will really be the greatest challenge of their race. They've never faced anything like this. Sure, they came out of the Ice Age, but this is an entirely different thing because the caribou populations are now shrinking. The sea ice that they depend upon for travel is no longer dependable. It's very dangerous. And there are animals coming to the north that they've never seen before. Their whole world is changing. But to answer your question, I think they're the toughest people on earth. They have a great sense of humor. I've never seen a trace of cynicism in any of the people that I've talked to. I remember asking one man, his name was Vince Onalik from the village of Noatak, what we could do about this. And he very gently said, well, maybe the people down south could reduce their emissions. And this is typical of not only Inuit and Inupiat people in the far north, but we have to think about all the other indigenous people around the world and low-lying lands, for instance, in Indonesia. It's the indigenous people in the world that have done the least to affect climate change or are going to be the most affected by it and suffer the most from it. Maybe the people down south could reduce their emissions, just a gentle statement that cuts right to the heart of it all.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, some of the changes you describe in your book, and you just talked a little bit about them, the greening of the Arctic. You saw a huge change in the vegetation, a lot of willow growth. Highly unusual.
We had a photograph of a portion of the river from more than a century ago, and we took a photograph in that very same spot more than 100 years later. And, there were poplar trees there that hadn't been there in the past. Poplar trees nearly 20 feet high. The dwarf birch and the willows were chest and head high when you could see in the photograph from the past that there was really just all tundra. And this has been going on for decades. As the sea ice has diminished, it's created this Arctic feedback loop, and the land in turn has warmed and the permafrost is thawing underneath the land. And it's allowed vegetation and even trees to continue to move north in a way they've never been in the north before. So it's become quite brushy and commonly referred to as a greening of the Arctic. And in turn, this draws animals into the north that had never been there before. For instance, there are now beavers heading up into the high Arctic because they have willows to eat and make dams with. And there are many more moose than used to be in the Arctic because they also are drawn by the new forage. And then, of course, there are also forest fires, rather wildfires that burn in the brush and sometimes beneath the tundra and the peat. So it's much more a crisis than what we see in the lower 48, just because it's a frozen world that's suddenly no longer frozen.
Yeah, I think I read someplace where Alaska is warming faster than anywhere else in the country and maybe the world. I'm not sure about that.
Well, in 2022, Scandinavian scientists weighed in, and since many other scientists and researchers have weighed in, and they figured that the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth, nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth.
That's incredible and hard to get your head around. Because one of the current concerns, as I understand it, is as that warm goes down into the permafrost, it releases more carbon to feed the problem.
Yeah, yeah. As what happens, there's all this ancient plant matter locked up, frozen in the ground, as well as animal matter, mastodons and dinosaur parts. And what happens is it warms, that the microbes begin to eat it, and that releases carbon dioxide, but it also releases methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas. And no one really knows how this can increase the effects of climate change, and but surely the greenhouse gases are likely to send us into a new dilemma with climate change.
Yeah. Now, you touched on the sea ice, and in your book, you talk about, correct me if I'm wrong, but you talk about the disappearance of sea ice and the problems that that is creating in terms of erosion and flooding.
Yeah, well, along the Beaufort Sea, which lines the north shore of Alaska and much of Canada, which Beaufort Sea is all part of the Arctic Ocean, because the lack of sea ice there, in particular, land-fast ice, which kind of sticks around most of the summer and actually protects the shore. Well, that land-fast ice has been disappearing over the last several decades, and it's caused the Beaufort Sea coastline to become one of the fastest, or the fastest eroding coastline in the world. So it's quite a problem. And as you can imagine, the lack of landfast ice exposes villages to storms and storm surges that have already inundated and flooded villages. There's over 36 villages in Alaska alone that are in danger from climate change, specifically from flooding, mostly from sea ice dissipating, but also some from rivers flooding, and the permafrost thawing at the same time. So it's not that the ocean is rising. I mean, it is rising very slowly, but it's, again, the lack of protective ice that usually lines the shoreline and prevents the storm tides from sweeping into these villages.
And so some of those villages, I guess they've talked about trying to relocate them, and that's no easy or inexpensive task.
Yeah, the village of Kivalina, for instance, where I finished my trip 2 years ago, is the Army Corps of Engineers estimates that that village will be inundated by the end of next year. And again, that's just one of several dozen villages that is in need of relocation. And there's a price tag of, and I'm sure it's a conservative figure, of $40 million to relocate that village.
And I guess it's not a question of do you want to move? It's you have to move.
You have to move. And, in the instance of Kivalina, those are coastal people their ancestors have lived there on the coast for thousands of years. And to move them inland is to sort of topple their whole sense of ancestry and definition of who they are as a people. They're a marine people, not an inland people.
So what's your takeaway over these explorations that you've taken over the years? I mean, is the Arctic too far down the road to reverse the impacts of climate change?
Well, yes, in many instances, let's face it, we can't stop climate change, particularly in the Arctic, but we can do a lot to minimize its impacts. And there's now legislation in the Senate specifically for relocation. The Alaska Village Relocation Act would appropriate federal funds for many of these villages that are in need of relocation.
What's your sense with the Trump administration coming into office in January? I mean, I believe they were in favor of the Ambler Road, and as we talked earlier, they opened up the Arctic National Refuge for oil drilling.
Yeah, only time will tell. I can't predict politically what's going to happen, but I'm probably as concerned as the next person people that are interested in the environment are all very concerned right now.
Is there any way to do a documentary of this book, so to speak? I mean, to go back and retrace with cameras? I mean, it really brings it to life when you can see what's going on.
Well, I'll hasten to add that my book has 77 photographs in it. So we did a very thorough documentation. We shot a tremendous amount of video, and we had thought of making a film, but we just haven't found a producer that's interested.
Really? That's amazing. Disappointing, but amazing. I am enjoying the photographs in your book. I've got an electronic copy on my iPad, and it's nice where you can enlarge them, and particularly the maps that you have there. And I'm curious, over the decades, the trips that you took, was there any specific chronology you wanted to put together in those trips, or was it just happenstance that this year I'm going to go over here, this year I'm going to go over there?
Well, I mentioned that I went back through my journals I have written about the Arctic before, but I hadn't really written that much about climate change. So the chronology in the book has a lot to do with those instances in my journals where I was able to recall or find mention of climate change. So that had everything to do with the chronology that I set up in the book. Of course, I left out many, many trips that I've done to the Arctic. There just wasn't room for it all. I didn't want it to be comprehensive, accounting of all of my trips in the North. I really wanted it to be comprehensive accounting of climate change as I encountered it.
So Jon, the book is focused primarily on Gates of the Arctic and Noatak River and Preserve, but they're not the only park units in Alaska.
Yeah, there are 5 park units in the Arctic, Alaska. And they're really a treasure that not many people know about. We traveled through Gates of the Arctic National Park, but then adjacent to that, I mentioned Noatak National Preserve, and then we wended our way up along the coast on Cape Krusenstern National Monument. But it's just an amazing resource. People think about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but these seldom visited parklands are yet another treasure as well.
Yeah, it's incredible. You were talking about one of them, maybe it's Gates of the Arctic in your book, and looking at the visitation numbers, and you point out that most of those people who said they visited the park really were outside of the park at a visitor center.
Right. So it's reliably the park that you can go to and count on having some time alone.
Yeah, no, it sounds wonderful. And as I said early on, it's still on my bucket list, and hopefully I can get it checked off before too long.
Do it. You must go.
Now, I believe you've also written about the Colorado River. No, you took a kayak trip, I think, from the headwaters and next to Rocky Mountain National Park down to Baja.
Yeah, in the early 90s, I took a trip from the northern Sea of Cortez, spent 2 months paddling all the way to the Cape, and wrote a book about what I perceived as the demise of the Sea of Cortez. And that alerted me to the Colorado River, because I essentially started near the Colorado River Delta in that early 90s journal. So in 2008, I got a grant from the National Geographic to do some reportage about the Colorado River. So I paddled from the headwaters of the Colorado River all the way to the Sea of Cortez. But sadly, the river does not reach the Sea of Cortez anymore. So I had to walk the last 90 miles.
Right. So what's your next project?
Don't know. I have to fix my back before I really can go on another expedition. And once I do that, then I'll be able to get my arms around what it is that I want to do.
Yeah, yeah. Nothing on the back burner that you will revisit once you get your surgery over with?
Well, I'm very interested in southwestern rivers, and I've spent a lot of time photographing rivers and learning about water as a resource, as a dwindling resource. And I feel like I have a lot more to say on that. So it's one of the things on my back burner.
Yeah, so maybe the Rio Grande.
The Rio Grande and the Gila and the Green and several others.
There's no shortage of stories out there, I'm sure. Well, Jon, thanks so much for joining us today. It's a wonderful book. I'm really enjoying it, and we're going to get it out there. And the writing is exquisite, but the message that you carry is a strong one, and hopefully people will take notice of it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
That's our show for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, Jon's latest book is Into the Thaw. If you're curious about Alaska's wildlands in general, or how climate change is impacting Alaska, it's a great resource. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repanshek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.